So David's Idea Farm Ventures incubates and invests in next-gen lifestyle brands. And your business focuses on Gen Zers and Millennials. Tell us why they're so important.
Okay, so that's a great question. Hopefully you guys can hear me. So I think whenever you think about a new cohort of consumers, the first thing is to think about the demographic impact. So if you look at the millennials, they're about 25% of the global population, and they're about $15 trillion in spending power. And then the Gen Z that's coming after, the Gen Z is now about 1/3 of the global population, about $5 trillion in spending, but that spending is going to go up to $30 trillion. So number one, just an incredibly important demographic group. But sort of putting on my old professor hat, what's actually more important is the psychographic, or the mindset, the values, the preferences, behaviors that the millennials and the Gen Z carry forward. They think about sustainability, they think about better for you, better for the planet products and services, they think about equity, they think about diversity, they think about all of the good things that they want to do to sort of reshape the world in their own image. And that mindset actually affects even someone like myself. I'm obviously not a millennial. My friend Paul might be in the millennial group. I'm a Gen Xer, but that mindset of reshaping the world, remaking the world in your own image is what's influencing the generations even that will come after, and also the generations that came before.
So I'm on the cusp of a millennial and a Gen Xer. I won't tell you exactly where, but just to remind everyone, a millennial is someone who's born between 1980 and 1995. A Gen Zer is somebody who's born between 1996 and 2005. Now, Paul, your Galaxy Racer is a transmedia powerhouse with over 100 content creators who have 500 million followers that generate over 2.5 billion monthly views. So, Paul, how do Gen Zers and Millennials affect media consumption, in your opinion? You're the best person to ask.
So the content consumption patterns have been completely changing over the last 20 to 30 odd years, right? And for us, what we realize is if we had to focus on the Gen Z and millennial generation, the entire focus would be around a digital device, which is your phones or anything else. And if you look at the majority of the content on that, they're either consuming social media, gaming, streaming, or they're listening to music. And for us in Galaxy Racer, what we do is we focus across all the 4 different medium forms, so that at every given content consumption point, we're going to be present out there. The biggest thing that we've seen is for Gen Z and millennials, and as David pointed out, I'm sort of in the early Gen Z generation. The content consumption is something that has kind of evolved, but still stayed something that we could really understand. I think the biggest change we're really going to see is over the next few years with Gen Alpha, where the majority of brands and gaming companies and platforms are going to see a fundamental shift in where content consumption is really going to change. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of running towards the end of marketing to the Gen Z and millennial range, but in the next 3 years, expect to see a very big shift.
Okay, I'm sure you're going to tell us all about that in just a moment. David, I'd like to ask you, some of the events that have shaped millennials and Gen Z, what were they, and how similar and how different are millennials and Gen Zers?
So great question. And I love the last panel, the discussion around operating under constraints and how that actually makes us better. And if you think about the Gen Z and the millennials, so the millennials sort of came of age during the Great Recession, and so that's when they were really coming into adulthood, and that really affected the way they thought and behaved. So they postponed child rearing. The dog is the new baby in some sense. They started to embrace things like co-working, co-living, the sharing economy, all of these different values. What's a little bit different about the Gen Z is they were sort of born during that period, and then they started to come of age during things like the great pandemic, the global age of sort of misinformation and disinformation, so they're much more distrustful. And so if I think of them in terms of a schema, I think about the millennials as fundamentally fairly sort of optimistic because they saw some good times and a recession came as they came of age. I would say that the Gen Zs are a little bit more skeptical and pessimistic. I would say that the the millennials are sort of the first really globally connected cohort because of everything Paul talked about, engagement with social media and so on, whereas the Gen Z is really the first global citizen. So one is sort of the digital pioneer, the second is the digital native. So you see these nuances of differences, but still carrying some of the markers of wanting better for you, better for the planet consumption to drive what we're doing on a daily basis.
Now, Paul, as I mentioned earlier, your platforms have 2.5 billion monthly views. So
Yes.
is this a platform-only approach to reach this demographic, or how does content play a role?
Oh no, it's not platform at all. It's completely content-driven, right? Because the current generation, and especially the people who are engaging across these platforms, don't engage with media in the traditional way. So if you're a brand and you're trying to market to this group, your traditional forms of getting an agency to create a campaign for you and having that campaign put across television and print and outdoor media, how does that work with a generation that doesn't watch TV, doesn't read, doesn't really engage with the outside world? Because if you look at most of these kids when they're out there in public transport, they have their earphones plugged in and they're not really engaging outside else. And then what the traditional forms of media started to do was they started to get out there onto social media and start doing digital advertising. And we were just flooded with so much of it that people started getting irritated. You see an ad on Instagram, you get pissed off. The first thing that you see when you see an ad on YouTube, you click on skip ad. And in fact, when that ad is shoved down your throat, you start having a negative connotation towards it. So they went back to doing something that's been around in Hollywood for over 40 to 50 years, product placement. So the only way to effectively monetize or to really get to that message was to put your product within the content itself. So everything today is all about content and eyeballs. Content is king, and that's what it's all about. The platform is irrelevant.
Incredible. So this is all done through influencers, I'm assuming.
Influencers, content creators, anything that's digital, anything that has eyeballs, music, anything.
David, what do you think? Why do you think it's a struggle to address and market to these groups? I mean, do you echo Paul's sentiments?
Yeah, 100%. I think what Paul's touching on is really interesting. If you think about why incumbent companies really struggle to address Millennial and Gen Z, there's sort of 3 or 4 things wrong with the way they're doing stuff. One is the past legacy of success actually works against them, the sort of top-down way of looking at markets as opposed to more of a bottom-up pain point, often from an individual founder. The second thing is the legacy ecosystem that they use. As Paul said, the old kind of agencies, the old modes of distribution, those things no longer kind of work. And then the third thing is that these incumbent companies really struggle to understand the new medium. And the medium is the content, the medium is the influencer, the medium is the community. And unless you can really embrace the medium and start thinking that the product also is the content, then you really kind of miss the boat on that. And I think that's why, I guess maybe the last thing is that a lot of traditional organizations also inherently very, very risk averse in terms of how they approach decision making. So that's the fourth layer that really inhibits them.
And Paul, with all of the new forms of media emerging around Gen Z and millennials, the gaming industry is obviously a leader in being able to reach these groups and engage with these audiences. Have brands come to terms with this, and are they capitalizing on this, or are they still trying to place their ads on YouTube and Instagram?
No, I think they have. Look, I mean, especially with the pandemic, gaming, esports, all of these became household terms which are not as common before. I think the last 3 years is the first time I've seen the shift when I tell people I'm in the gaming industry, the first question wouldn't be like, oh, do you mean gambling or do you mean gaming? No. The first thing is it's traditional gaming, right? I'm fortunate that I've been in the industry for over 23 odd years in doing this. I think what's going to happen, and touching upon my earlier point about the big shift that's going to happen with Gen Alpha, is we first saw the evolution with gaming with individual gaming, which then focused into storytelling and then went on to online gaming. What's going to happen now is the evolution of gaming into social platforms. And I see the first example of that is something like Roblox. And the biggest thing that I saw a few years ago was my 7-year-old at that time sitting around with his friends around a digital tree and just talking. They weren't doing anything else. They weren't playing. They weren't doing anything else. And I think as these platforms continue to evolve, brands will realize that they need to be present in these platforms as well. Right now, they're doing that same thing with Facebook. They're doing it on YouTube. Well, if you want a presence with this audience, then you need to be present in the worlds of Roblox and Fortnite and everything else that are, quote unquote, the large metaverses, although I hate that word, because these open worlds have been around for the last 15, 16 odd years. But that's where it's going to shift towards interactive open world platforms.
So you don't see any difference between the metaverse terminology that was being used 15 years ago and what's happening now?
No, I think what's happened is there was a terminology for metaverse 15 years ago, and I think what's happened is this might be popular and unpopular, the blockchain and crypto community appropriated that word to take what we used to call open world environments, the likes of Project Entropia, World of Warcraft, they've been around for 15 odd years, and apply that towards their industry. So it just kind of got really mixed and mashed with crypto and blockchain and all that, so it's just started to have a very negative connotation towards it.
David, what tactics and strategy have found success with millennials and Gen Z? How do you reach these groups?
So I think just to continue our discussion of earlier, what's really, really important is, first of all, creating content that these people really want to consume for its own sake. So it's a change in mindset from push marketing to pull marketing. So instead of, Gillette, let every man be the man that he wants to be, and sort of pushing that down your throat, what's the organic pull method of doing that? So that starts, first of all, with content. Secondly, a really important terminology that we use at Idea Farm is turning your customers into orators. So people who want to tell the story or the narrative of your brand and your journey, as opposed to a transactional customer relationship. And then thirdly, building a community around that brand, whether it's the community of the orator, customers, but also the influencers and the other people that are going to make that engine grow. And then I suppose sort of fourth and finally, just having a brand that really resonates and really has a reason to exist in the world. I think it was Bhavan, one of the earlier panelists, said, the most important thing you have to think about is not what you're doing, but are you actually playing in the right area? Are you playing the right game? And if you have a brand that truly reflects that and has a reason to exist, then you have something that will sustain.
And what would you say are the biggest challenges that marketers are facing in creating and marketing services for the next generation?
What we face, and for example, for us, is actually something that we solved. And again, this is going to sound a little unpopular, but big brands are used to working with really big agencies because they have small teams with very large budgets and are inherently a little lazy, right? So I'm used to working with WPP and Interpublic, giving them billions of dollars and let them go out and do that. The challenge that this industry faced was there wasn't a large platform available that could service them the same way. So if you wanted to work with an influencer, you go to an influencer agency. You want to work with an esports team, you go find an esports organization. You want to work with a YouTuber, you go find little agencies. And big brands are not used to working with 50 little agencies out there. So we started solving that problem in our company by treating all of these different things, whether it's esports, it's gaming, it's music, as just content touch points. Packaging it all together and going to the brand saying, look, I'm going to service you the same way that the big agencies do. You don't have to worry about any of this content distribution, and we'll just give you output on the other end. Now, since we've done that, other people have started to follow suit, which is a lot of consolidation that's happening. And I think the challenge that you're talking about is something that brands faced 2 or 3 years ago. Now it's starting to get a lot more effective.
And what are some of the characteristics of brands that are really loved by millennials? David, what have you invested in?
So happy to share some of those, and maybe we'll put some pictures up in the moment. But I think sort of 2 things that are really important for the millennial and Gen Z audience is the brand really has to sort of stand for something. There has to be a core set of values that resonate with that audience. As Paul said, because content and community is so critical, and using the right ecosystem of influences and everything else to propel the brand, that's absolutely critical that we have that as a first touch point. And then secondly, brands that are really sort of bold and stand for something. So one of my favorites, I'm not an investor, but maybe this is good for the Gen Z or Gen Z wannabe in the audience. There's a brand called Liquid Death. I don't know if anyone here knows Liquid Death. Paul does. It's literally water in a can. And the tagline, black humor, is murder your thirst, okay? And the Gen Z and millennials love it because it's completely sustainable. It's aluminum, so it's infinitely recyclable. There's no plastic. And it has this kind of dark humor that really appeals to these Gen Z people growing up with a pandemic, growing up with misinformation, disinformation, climate change, social justice, all of these things. So this is now, I think, Paul, maybe a unicorn company, literally water in a can. I wish I was an investor in that, but we can talk about these ones in a moment. I'll turn back to Paul.
Let's talk a little bit about the emergence of the creator economy and its impact on Gen Zers and millennials. Who really has the upper hand here? Is it the creator or is it the fan?
I think this is something that goes back all the way through to the celebrity culture back in the 70s or 80s, the fans create the celebrities, right? The celebrity is very, very, his job is to go out there and create effective content, but without the fans, there are no celebrities. It's gotten a little more challenging now because back in the day, you know, they were sort of untouchable. Today, because through social media, they can be in touch with them. They can actually leave a comment. If they don't like something about you, they can cancel you. They can leave a whole bunch of stuff out there. So I'd say, yes, there is the balance of power is kind of fairly even right now, where you have these, you know, almost godlike people out there, but then the fan being able to call you out if you're actually doing something wrong or something that you don't agree with.
David, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
What came first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, you know, I'm from New Zealand. We eat a lot of lamb, but we eat some chicken. So I'll start with the chicken. I'll just go back to that brand that was on the slide for a second, the Caraway, as an example of your
Sure.
question that you asked earlier, Ramya. So this is a great example of a brand that appeals to both millennial and Gen Z. And it sort of rides this marker of during the pandemic and other things happening, people wanted to socialize, they wanted to cook at home. Both millennial and Gen Z were starting to do this. And if you looked at all the incumbent companies, the products were very, very high priced. The products didn't really have a great aesthetic. The products had a lot of toxic chemicals, even the expensive ones. And then finally, this is the theme that Paul and I have been talking about, the incumbent companies in cookware literally had no digital game. They did not know how to address this audience. So Jordan here, the founder of Caraway, which is a brand that we've invested in, has actually had profitable growth, which we're really happy about. And he's really sort of reinventing the way millennials and Gen Z think about cooking and recipes and socialization and time together through sort of beautifully aesthetic, non-toxic, you know, value-priced products.
Interesting. I've never seen that in the UAE, but we'll definitely check it out. So let's go back to our original question, David, which is, who has the upper hand? Is it the creator or is it the fan?
Boy, I think it's really, and Paul, I'm curious as your opinion here too, I think the term co-creator becomes really important here. There's a sort of symbiotic relationship between the founder and the creator of a company and the fans or the orators who kind of buy into it. So I think it's symbiotic and it's a matter of balance. I think in the old days it was very much Coke and Pepsi and McDonald's, you know, all those ubiquitous global companies, they kind of had the upper hand telling you what to eat, what to wear, with whom to associate and so on. But now it's a much more balanced relationship. I guess sometimes it tips to where maybe the fan has the power maybe to disrupt you, but I see it as very balanced in the best possible cases.
Yeah, I could probably follow up on that a little bit. I think, you know, especially YouTube is one of the perfect examples of the first time where we've been able to see a creator create top quality content and his fan eventually become a celebrity or creator himself, right? So one thing that's really common in YouTube is you have people to go out there and create videos. But then a lot of times what people will do is they create reaction videos to those things. And these guys will initially start out as fans and they're creating all of these reaction videos, but all I'm doing is reacting to what David is saying, and eventually over time, I become a celebrity myself. Now, this wasn't possible 30, 40 years ago, right? You could go watch your celebrities on screen, but just by talking about them or commenting about them, you couldn't, you know, the best you could become as a film critic or something of that sort. But here, it's the first time that we've actually seen this thing happening, where a fan can actually become a celebrity himself.
Tell us a little bit more about this alpha generation that you were discussing earlier. Tell us who are they, what are their characteristics, what is meaningful to them?
I think Gen Alpha is anybody you'd consider 10 and below, right? The biggest change I'm seeing right now is the entire content consumption pattern for them is completely different. The way they game, the way they hang out. When you talk about the metaverse, right, and a lot of people associate the metaverse with VR, I look at my own house as an example, because I've got 5 kids from 25 all the way down to 5. The only one comfortable spending more than 20 to 30 minutes in the Oculus is my 10-year-old. And he'll do that for hours and hours and hours every day. So when people talk about the metaverse and everything else, yes, that audience, it will happen, but that audience is currently 10 years old today. Right, so that's the big change.
20 to 30 minutes in the Oculus?
No, at least. I can barely spend 5 or 10 minutes before I get sick, right? But for them, it's just, I don't know, it's an evolution or something that they're happening that they can just absorb all of that content at the same time.
And David, what are your thoughts on this upcoming generation?
So I think, first of all, as Paul said, obviously very, very different in terms of how they interact with devices and how they see themselves as sort of straddling the two worlds, right, that we all straddle, the digital world and the physical world, and how they move seamlessly together. And I think I'll just add one last thing that ties into what Paul said. I think it was fascinating about the fans becoming the creators. In the digital economy, your audience has an audience. And then that audience has another audience. So the sort of perpetuation of fandom, I think, is one of the most fascinating things that you see. I spend a lot of time in LA, so I know about Kim Kardashian and that kind of thing.
Probably more than you care to, I suspect. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today. We've run out of time for this panel. Appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.